It's Wednesday.
We have had short presentations from three compelling and dynamic speakers, and I'm sure they'll entertain some questions. Yes.
I must say, I love the last presentation. I loved them all. I lived this. One of the critical things out of what you mentioned, and might have been what you wanted to continue to say.
Yeah, I got a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, is I think this whole face of poverty, people miss, especially in the area you're in right now, because like in our cultural community, we've always been called land rich and cash poor. So we have land, someone may own 5, 10 acres of land by themselves, and we still grow food on it because that's what our ancestors were brought here to do. Someone mentioned cotton, rice, and indigo. That are we who've been to grow that thing. So here it is, though, when people think of the board seats that you just mentioned, most of our people are not going to come to that meeting because they're already not going to trust why they're being invited. If they get to the meeting, they feel intimidated because then they get there and there's nobody that looks like them, or nobody sometimes to translate the language from that environmental world or whatever you want to call it back to the land movement into their language. And it's interesting to us, there's this new back to the land movement that looks elitist, wherein what about the remain on the land movement that we've always been a part of? And many of the people that you're talking about that get the food stamps still to supplement what they can grow, or when it's off season and they can't grow, are those folks. So again, in a situation like this, someone might appear to be in the same class as you, but not. They might have had to borrow from everybody in the family to get the money to register for a meeting like this.
We only have 10 minutes for the whole room, so, I mean, do you
Okay, yeah, okay, got you. So how is that going to change? I mean, if all of what you said is great, but if you don't consider what the real realities are, how is what you're saying going to actually happen? How's it going to change?
I think we have to open an entire new dialogue, and I think, you know, some kind of a potluck dinner, as my ma was, when we had problems with the neighbors, she fed them. And listen, over a really good meal, you can talk about things that might get you into a fist fight if there's not food on the table and it doesn't slow you down for a minute and you don't go through the act of giving thanks for what's in front of you. I think we need new styles of dialogues, new styles of convenings and meeting. But I love, you know, the fact that the Still on the Land movement, and I want to honor that because there was one thing I meant to say. Roosevelt in '43 gave a speech thanking American victory gardeners because the USDA said that in 1942 they studied that 48% of all fresh food consumed by Americans in 1942 came from privately held victory gardens. In '42 we were at half the population we are today. Do the math. A quarter of our fresh food would be coming from privately held victory gardens. It was at scale, it can be at scale again, and with all the community gardening movements that Joan is promoting and talking about in Detroit and other communities of poverty, self-reliance is being co-opted by people who don't even know what the word of that means. Imagine if communities can actually completely support themselves and not have to rely on being fed by a big agribusiness company. You know, maybe we just don't need that form of agriculture at all. Who really knows? I think it's scalable and doable, but I think we need to change the dialogue and everybody needs to be at the table.
Okay, another question. Back there, I think. And then there's one deep in the corner.
Good afternoon. I have a question for you, Joan. My name is John Rashford, and I'm a faculty member here at the College of Charleston, and interested in the origins of agriculture and food, and appreciated your remarks. How do you address the issue of separating industrial processes from the poor use of industrial processes to produce food? In other words, it disturbs me a lot when I encounter so many young people that think the problem is industrialization itself rather than the way in which it's being used. Is that a meaningful distinction to you, or does it?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I have been guilty of being told I was once in Australia and giving talks, and I said something about the problem with food supply, and somebody said, we have to work with the food industry, and I said, you can't work with the food industry. The difficulty is that they have a totally different goal. Their goal is to use the smallest amount of real food possible to make the most expensive product. Our goal is to get people to try to eat what's good for them. The great bulk of what's out there, they would be much better off without. And so it's very hard for me. I mean, maybe if I were younger, I'd be more flexible, but I cannot tell you how many meetings I have sat in where somebody brought together the food industry and people like me and said, okay, let's figure out a way that we can regulate so that the products are better, or that we can create better products. And I'm fairly good with words, and they would, often it would be, there would be 5 people behind the head of General Mills, and there would be me here. They always had backup troops at the meetings. And then when it came time somebody had to do something, they would pick me. So I had to go home, type it, duplicate it, carry it to the post office by hand. Anyway, but I did these things, and I came up with really good ideas for how we could create a regulatory system that would prevent the kind of crap that we have in, purple marshmallow enriched breakfast cereals. The minute it would get to that point, they were gone. They were gone. They set up, we had an advertising thing, and the day we had our 3rd or 4th meeting, they were out there saying, oh, we're setting up a National Advertising Review division of children's division, and we're, they won't sit still to do that. So I don't know how to work. Maybe somebody can figure out how to do it, but I don't know how to do it, because what they want to do is make a new product, and basically, I don't think with 30,000, 40,000. There were 8,000 items in the supermarket when I was born. 800. I take it back. 800. It sort of doubled by the year, and we now have 30 to 40,000 items in the supermarket. And I could eat perfectly well from the 800 items that were there. Everything was there I needed. We now have all this stuff, and the problem of a nutrition educator, who has time to know what's in those products? I mean, you could read labels for all that gets you. And what does that mean anyway? It's all fragmented. These fragmented raw materials are reconstituted into a food product. We don't know anything about the health of those items. Nothing. And once the FDA took, Michael Pollan picked this up in his book, in his really groundbreaking book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. He picked up the fact that the FDA had taken off the rule which existed when I first started school. That is, if you wanted to make something that looked like butter that wasn't, you had to call it imitation. You had to call it imitation pudding. You had to call it imitation. They took off that regulation. All it had to do was have substantial nutritional equivalence, which means put in the right vitamins and minerals and it's equivalent. And we were, from that point on, we really had no control over what was in the food supply.
Wes, do you want industrialization versus industrial agriculture?
I try to think about this problem from the point of view of systems theory. And I think there's a general law, and that is highly dense energy destroys information of the cultural and biological varieties. And we're involved in a Sisyphus effort with our attempts to bring some sanity. I was trying to think of an illustration. In a field in which you have introduced anhydrous ammonia, which is nitrogen, your bacteria shut down. Your plants don't accommodate the nodule bacteria. Those nodule bacteria, which are anaerobic, that attach to the root, operate at 4/5 of an atmosphere using 21 enzymes, and hydrous ammonia is created at 350 atmospheres and 400 degrees C. When you have that kind of resource coming at your system, your biological system shuts down. It doesn't matter how much that legume plant would love to be producing its own nitrogen. It just can't do it. So what I hear is a problem that has to do with social justice, a problem that has to do with health, a problem that has to do with the loss of cultural capacity. The people that left the land, especially after World War II, but before they were already, it is roughly proportional to the increase of highly dense carbon coming into those systems. A corn plant is lazy. It won't do any more than you expect of it. It won't develop resistance. It won't have resistance if it doesn't need resistance to a pathogen. I believe there are ghost-like qualities associated with and is proportional to the density of the carbon coming into the system. And I think what we're doing is pumping our fists and blaming ourselves, but in a way we're like children in a candy store and been told you can have as much as you want. But then we see that some of the children get sick, and so you want to do something to restrict that from happening. But as long as those candy stores stay open and the children are free to come in, they're going to go for it. And so I think what our side needs to do, I'm not disagreeing with anything that's been said, but I think what our side needs to do as we think about the industrial versus the more sensible is appreciate that there are, I'll call them ghost-like factors at work that override our consciousness of what's really wrong. And, well, okay, yeah, sure.
I think we got the gist of the answer.
Well, I got more to say.
I know you do. And there is time after this to meet with the panel.
So this is a food chain discussion, and I'm a farmer. I'm being invaded by 4 invasive species, not counting just within the past couple of years, those that were already here invading the area. I look for information, for help, and my land-grant institution, the other colleges and universities. Where can I get help?
Okay, who wants to take on invasives? Joan?
Yeah, sure.
Wes? Okay, briefly.
I'll tell you where you can.
Bar soon.
Yeah, I'll tell you where you can get help. Read the yearbooks of agriculture before 1940.
Joan, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm interested in what the invasives, you mean insects and diseases? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Not crops, not biotech crops or anything? Okay. I think it's happening to all of us. They're all moving because of global warming, so we get all these novel things and the novel weeds. I have novel kinds of grass in my yard I've never seen before. So I think we're all going to have to go through a very serious period of adaptation, and I wish the land-grant colleges would catch up, but if they, how we get that changed, Wes should tell us.
Michel.
I would say just a quick plug for the Rodale Institute. They have the longest standing side-by-side certifiable, conventional certified organic study of what happens year after year after year after year, and they're dealing with exactly the same thing, but the resilience of the organic is starting to show stronger and stronger and stronger every year. It's been outpacing conventional for quite some time, but it's open source. So I really would encourage you to reach out to them. They've been a little bit silent because there have been just, passings in the family. Maria Rodale now is the president of the Institute, and they really want to drive to make this information more viable because they see the tensions that the changing environment are creating, and they're having some success in these side-by-side studies with a lot of these invasives, so I would encourage you to go there.
Okay, one more question. I think there's one deep in the corner, or is it we've addressed it? Okay, anyone else? Last question, incredibly pithy. Yes. You can do it jointly.
She already had a question. I'd like to ask Wes, what about feeding refugees in the world? We have just announced today that 500,000 people are eating somewhere out of their country in Syria, and then we have the Palestinian, we have the Sudanese, the Congo refugees. Where does that food come from?
Well, a lot of it comes through the various food programs of like everything from the National Council of Churches to some of the food that is made available through USAID and whatnot.
That's not a problem. I think the question is where, if you change the agricultural system, you still have the same volume of crops.
Well, I think we don't appreciate to what extent the most important invention of the 20th century does. I mean, without it, 40% of humanity wouldn't be here now. It's the Haber-Bosch process that turns atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. And, there are a lot of third world type countries that are getting the benefits of Haber-Bosch.
Joan, do you have
I'd like to make a seriously political comment, which is that we've really
I
spent.
think we accept that on this panel.
I know, I'm well aware of that. I'm sorry. We've spent a lot of time in this country and a lot of effort and a lot of grain and a lot of exports making people dependent on us. So the best thing we can do is to try to help countries. I mean, the first thing that happened when we took over Iraq, I don't know if you have read about this, but when Brennan went in and was the high mucky-muck, one of the first things that happened was they made sure that they would allow biotech in. Now, that didn't seem to me to be a high priority in Iraq. We had already wiped out most of the farmers with all the bombardment and everything, but that's what it was. So we really are guilty of creating a lot of the hunger around the world, and the best thing we could do would be to reform our agencies which did that. I mean, I used to give to my students a brochure that AID put out called Aid, What's in It for You? Because most of the money we sent overseas came back in contracts for American contractors. So it's like we're terrible sinners, and we need to back off from that and let people feed themselves. That's what I meant about food sovereignty. That's the big move now. And I know the refugee problem is horrendous, but part of the refugee problem is also resource poor countries or countries who haven't managed to free themselves from colonial whatever. Right. We have a lot of leftover problems.
I'd like to close by saying there are refugees of war, but there are also refugees of agriculture, literally by the hundreds of millions that have been displaced from indigenous lands for clear cutting, for vast soy and corn and maize production, that when they were left alone, they weren't contributing to the economy per se, but they were raising goats and raising their own food, working in the jungle with indigenous plants and cultures, completely self-reliant for millennia, who are now in the slums of Sao Paulo and countless cities in Africa,
and
needing free food because their right to be able to produce for themselves has been taken away. So there are many kinds of refugees that often are victims of the symptom. I think the problems are big, and we're going to need big ag for some time. But over time, I envision a lot less giant, eventually it going away. tons more mid-size and millions more small, getting back to the self-reliance that we've taken away that caused the problem in the first place.
Let me just recommend one book I read on the way here, so it's very much at the top of my mind. It's by Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things and won a Pulitzer or some prize. I don't remember the Man Booker Prize. And she has not written another novel since she has taken on her country, which is India. And I just read her book, a very little short book called Walking with the Comrades, which is about her going back into the woods of India, into the area where the untouchables and the Maoists have been working, and looking at the whole question of what these people are really doing. Are they really in rebellion against India? Are they really wildly whatever? And it's just, she's a very thoughtful person, and it's a wonderful book. And I thought to myself, did I know this was happening? No, I didn't know this was happening. I mean, India's tremendous industrial development is on the backs of these poor people.
With that, I think we'll bring this session to changing the food system in the Low Country to a close. But listen, first, Michel, Joan, Wes, thank you very much. That was, as promised, provocative.